Hello again. I hope you're ready for bed. This is a cool story about a veterinarian. His name was James Harriet, and he lived in England. This story is a short story about an animal that he knew called Only One Woof. One nice thing about being a country vet is that there's so many interesting things to see when I visit the farms. One sunny day I visited Mr. Wilkins' farm, and I laughed as I watched the two sheepdog puppies playing together in the farmyard. "Those two really love each other, don't they?" I said. Mr. Wilkin nodded. "Aye, that means yes. Aye, they are great friends. They are never apart." Study this picture for a minute and you'll see the puppies right here playing together. Mr. Wilkin was a busy man with many cows, pigs, and sheep to look after, but still he had time for his favorite hobby, breeding and training sheepdogs. For many years he had won silver cups all over the country. From the latest litter he had picked the two best pups, Jip and Sweep, and he was going to train them to run in the sheepdog trials. Now, a sheepdog is a working dog. If you look right here, we have dogs who are taught how to help herd the sheep or move them along together in a group. That's what he's very good at, is training the sheep to help take care of the dogs. Here he is with a dog helping to herd cows and move the cows along. They have to learn exactly how to listen to their master, and they know exactly what they must or must not do with the animals. The two little animals were rolling about in a happy wrestling match, growling and panting, chewing gently at each other's legs. Then suddenly they stopped playing as something else caught their attention. "Look at that!" I cried in amazement. "They're behaving like grown-up dogs." Do you see these two? They're crouching low, getting down very close to the ground, and trying to herd some little tiny birds. Let's read about it. They're behaving like grown-up dogs. The pups were beginning to round up a group of tiny ducklings, much to the annoyance of the mother duck. With noses outstretched and stomachs nearly flat on the cobblestones of the farmyard, they crept up on the little ducklings. "Yes," the farmer said, "they are only 12 weeks old, but their mother and father, their grandmother and grandfathers, and away back as long as I can remember, were all sheepdogs. So these little things were born wanting to round up chickens, ducks, lambs, anything they see." The two doggy friends were different in appearance. Sheep was black and white, Sweep was black and white, while Jip was black, white, and brown. But the thing you noticed most about them was one of Jip's ears stuck up while the other lay flat against his head. This gave him a funny, lopsided look. In fact, he looked like a bit of a clown, but he was a friendly, tail-wagging clown. "There's one odd thing about Jip," Mr. Wilkins said. "He's never barked at all." I looked at him in surprise. "You mean never ever?" "That's right, not a single bark. The other dogs make a noise when strangers come to the farm, but I've never heard Jip make a sound ever since he was born." I shook my head. How very strange. I've never heard of such a thing. Remember, he's an animal doctor, and he thinks that's very unusual. I got into my car, and as I drove away, I noticed that while Sweep and two other farm dogs barked their farewells loudly, Jip merely wagged his tail and looked at me in a friendly manner, his pink tongue lolling out of his open mouth. A silent dog. Here goes the veterinarian in his car, and most of the dogs are barking at him as he leaves, but not Jip. He is sitting silently. Remember, Jip is the one that's got the brown back. Some months later, just before Christmas, George Crossley, one of Mr. Wilkins' oldest friends, and a very keen sheepdog trainer, came to ask if he could buy a dog, as his own old dog had died. Mr. Wilkins sold Sweep to him. I was a bit surprised about this because I knew that Sweep was further forward in his training than Jip, and looked like turning into a real champion. But it was Jip he kept, perhaps because he just liked him. He was a funny dog with that lopsided charm, and that was difficult to resist. So here he is with just Jip left, keeping this one, selling this one. Jip must have been sad to lose his brother and best friend, and there was no doubt that he missed him. But there were other dogs on the farm, and even if they didn't make up for Sweep, he was never really lonely. Although Jip grew up big and strong, he wasn't quite clever enough to compete in trials. So he just helped Mr. Wilkin by herding the sheep and cattle on the farm. He was very happy to be out with his master all day, but perhaps he wondered where his doggy friend had gone. Here he is out helping to get the sheep. It wasn't until the following June that I next visited the farm to see a sick cow, and I saw Jip, now fully grown, rocking along on a hay cart. This is how they used to gather up hay. They'd take it from the field, cut it, and put it in this wagon, and then take it and stack it somewhere. There's Jip, right on top. I spotted him again at harvest time, chasing rats among the stalks. He was always glad to see me, full of fun, bright-eyed and affectionate, but still soundless. There he is, still no barking of any kind. There was a very long spell when none of Mr. Wilkins' animals needed my help, and I did not see him or Jip until I met them both at a sheepdog trial the following summer. The huge field where the trial was being held was on the river's edge, and the sunshine glinted on the water. The cars were drawn up along the side of the field, and groups of men, mainly competitors, stood around chatting as they watched the dogs working with the sheep. They were dressed in all sorts of clothing, cloth caps, trilbies, deerstalkers, or sometimes no hat at all. Tweed jackets, best suits, open-necked shirts, fancy ties, and sometimes neither collar nor tie. Nearly all of them leaned on long crooks with the handles carved from ram's horns. Here they are, standing around talking. These are the men who are going to compete in the contest of who has the best trained dog. Their dogs waited their turn, and they were tied to the fence. It was wonderful to see a long row of waving tails and friendly expressions. Few of the dogs knew each other, but there was not a single growl. Never mind a fight. So here are the dogs. They've all been very well trained. I went over to Mr. Wilkin, who was leaning against his car, which was parked within sight of the final pen. Jip was tied to the bumper and was watching with interest as each dog took his turn. So they're all watching the sheep, including Jip, who's tied up right here. He's watching the other animals compete. Jip was tied to the bumper and was watching with interest as each dog took its turn. Mrs. Wilkin was sitting on a camp stool by his side. "Are you running a dog today, Mr. Wilkin?" I asked. "No, not this time. I've just come to watch," he replied. So he's not competing. He's just watching the competition. I had been there for about 10 minutes when suddenly the farmer lifted a pointing finger. "Look who's there!" George Crossley with Sweep were making their way to the starting post. Jip suddenly stiffened and sat up, very straight, one ear cocked, the other flat, making him look more lopsided than ever. Here he is. There's Jip watching, and way down here is the farmer, George Crossley, who came and bought his brother. It was over a year since I had seen his brother, and it seemed unlikely, I thought, that he would remember him. But he was obviously very interested, and as the judge waved his white handkerchief to begin the trial, and the 3 sheep were released from the far corner of the field, Jip rose slowly to his feet. A gesture from Mr. Crossley sent Sweep racing around the edge of the field in a wide, joyous gallop, and as he neared the sheep, a whistle from Mr. Crossley made him drop onto his stomach. From then on, it was easy to see that Sweep was going to be the champion, as he darted and crouched at his master's commands. Short whistles, long whistles, Sweep understood all of them. So, his master whistles at the dog to tell him exactly what to do as he's trying to round up these sheep. That dog is really good at following commands. No other dog all day had brought his sheep through the 3 pairs of gates as easily as Sweep did now, and as he entered the final pen, it was obvious he was going to win unless the sheep scattered at the last moment. George Crosley opened the gate wide and held out his crook. I could hardly hear his commands to Sweep, but his quiet words brought the dog wriggling inch by inch over the grass towards the sheep, where they were going to go bounding away. Were they going to go bounding away and spoil everything? I held my breath, but no. After hesitating and looking around a few times, the sheep turned and entered the pen, and Mr. Crosley banged the gate behind them. As he did so, he turned to Sweep with a happy cry of, "Good lad!" and the dog answered with a quick wag of his tail. At that, Jip, who had been standing very still, watching every move intently, raised his head and gave a single loud bark, which echoed around the field. "Woof!" went Jip. Jip, who had never barked. "Woof!" went Jip, and we all stared at him in astonishment. "Did you hear that?" gasped Mrs. Wilkin. "Well, I don't believe it," her husband burst out, looking open-mouthed at his dog. Jip didn't seem to realize that he had done anything unusual. George Crosley came over with Sweep, and the 2 dogs greeted each other happily. Mr. Wilkin let Jip off his lead, that's his leash, and within seconds the 2 dogs were rolling around, chewing playfully at each other as they used to do as pups. I suppose the Wilkins, as well as myself, had the feeling that this event might encourage Jip to bark like any other dog. But it was not to be. 6 years later, I was at the farm and went to the house to get some hot water. As Mrs. Wilkin handed me the bucket, she looked down at Jip, who was basking in the sunshine outside the kitchen door. There he is, right there. "There you are, you funny fellow," she said to the dog. I laughed. "Has he ever barked since that day?" Mrs. Wilkin shook her head. "No, he hasn't. Not a sound. I waited a long time, but I don't think he'll ever bark." "Oh, well, it's not important, but I'll never forget that afternoon at the trial," I said. So the veterinarian is asking the owner's wife, "Has he ever barked again?" She says no. "Nor will I forget." Mrs. Wilkin looked at Jip again, and she smiled as she remembered. Poor old lad, 8 years old, and only 1 woof. It's kind of cool that the only time this dog ever barked was to call to his brother dog. They hadn't seen each other for over a year, and he wanted his brother to know he was there. That's a cool story, isn't it? I hope you're sleepy. Have a good night's sleep. See you soon.